Hi, how are you? Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here. Glad to see all of you guys here. I think we're starting a little bit early, so that's okay because the presentation actually is built for about an hour and 20 minutes, and I'll condense it down so we have time for questions. Just so everyone knows we're in the right spot, advanced gadget and UI development, focusing mostly on the Google AJAX APIs. But we'll talk about how the application itself was completely built. This is a real-life application that I built using the AJAX APIs. It was spurred on by Google Corporate, and we'll talk about a little bit about the application itself. So the agenda for the talk is to talk about the application concept, how Google Corporate actually came to the team and me specifically and asked about building this application, what the basic building blocks were that we use and how we actually go about putting those together. Obviously, we'll talk about the AJAX APIs. How many people here are familiar with the AJAX APIs? Okay, I'll go into a little bit of background about them. You saw some of the AJAX APIs in play in the keynote that Marissa gave, and Tom Stocky actually did the demo. I'll actually talk a little bit about the high-level part of the APIs themselves. I'll talk about each of the APIs that we used. We used search, feeds, and language in this demo. And then, of course, as we talk about how the app was built, we'll talk about how we specifically use those APIs. And the goals for the talk are simply to give a quick high-level understanding of the AJAX APIs, but then actually dig down and explore how an application is actually built, how we hope that these APIs make your job easier, and actually you get a feel for how powerful the APIs can be. We've built these APIs such that they have drop-in controls and that you can use 2 or 3 lines of JavaScript to get some pretty powerful effects. But we're also going to show how you can keep uncovering different functionality and go deeper and allow the APIs to work for you. At the end, I'm going to show you how approaching an application and developing one like this, how at the end we can wrap it up as an iGoogle gadget. During the keynote, you saw how if you're specifically designing a gadget, how you can actually use the Google Gadget Editor. And that's obviously one way to go about it. I'm going to show you a little bit different way, and then hopefully you guys can make the right decision on what makes the most sense for you. So the application concept. Google has a lot of blogs that different parts of the company actually participate in. Obviously, it started out very small, but it's gotten to the point now where it's over 100. And what corporate wanted was a way to install as an application or as a gadget some sort of application that showcased all of these blogs, but had a small footprint, allowed you to view them in multiple views, allowed you to search over all the blogs, and obviously see the newest information. Google, as hopefully is evident to you guys by the fact that we're here, is a very global company. And so we also wanted to make sure that as blogs were participating in different languages, people who are reading those blogs, if they wanted to read them in their native language, could do so. And so we actually used the language API also. So we brainstormed and came up with the application concept, what we kind of wanted to do. And then we set about figuring out how to build it. And I had the task of actually building it, and I volunteered. I wanted to kind of eat our own dog food is a term we use a lot. So when you go about building an application, this is strictly a web-based application that we're going to wrap up as a gadget. Obviously, you can't get away from HTML, DOM, CSS, JavaScript, obviously with the APIs. Tools. I'm going to talk a little bit about the tools that I used. You guys can use different tools if you would like, but for the purpose of the talk, I thought it was interesting to actually go through exactly what I did to build the application, to give you a feel. Sometimes advanced talks kind of skip some of the easier pieces in terms of the hello world, how you actually get started. I'm not going to do that. I'll actually go ahead and tell you exactly what I did. We're going to dive a little bit into the AJAX APIs that were used for the application. And we use a good deal of each of the main 3 ones, which are search, feeds, and language. We're also going to talk about Google Reader and its role and why it was necessary for the application itself and how it actually made the job of building the application easier. We'll talk about Google Custom Search Engine and how we actually utilize that, and there was a choice to be made and how we actually made the trade-offs there based on what we wanted the application to do. And then we'll talk about iGoogle at the end. How many people here know about Firebug? Good, good. The gentleman who started the AJAX APIs team with me, Mark Lakowski, challenged me about a year and a half ago to learn JavaScript. And I refused because I said, it's a tough environment. There's no tools, there's no debuggers, there's no editors, things like that. I'm old. I use Emacs. There's very little support there. And along came a developer named Joe Hewitt who actually wrote Firebug. And it really changed the landscape of what developers can do within a browser in terms of being able to set breakpoints in JavaScript, change CSS on the fly, inspect DOM elements. So if you haven't yet, and it sounds like a lot of you have in terms of the hands being raised, if you haven't, please go get it. It is indispensable as a tool, and I highly recommend it. The other tool that was mentioned there that I'll talk about is YSlow, which kind of shows you performance about how your web application does. Another very good tool. The gentleman that actually wrote that, Steve Souders, wrote that while he was at Yahoo, and he's actually now at Google now, so it's very exciting for us. So what are the Google AJAX APIs? This is kind of a high-level intro, quick intro, because this is more of an advanced talk. But it's a RESTful data layer onto the technologies that exist at Google that we felt were important and beneficial to the developer community to release. Mark Lakowski and myself within Google have done a lot of work with XML. We kind of took a snapshot of the landscape and saw that JSON was the up-and-coming data representation. It was the right way to go about that. And so we wanted to give access and return results in obviously a RESTful address space, but then JSON as the data format, or JSON-P in terms of packaging it up and springboarding back into the browser. So at the base layer, and again, 2 years ago when we started this, we started with search. We have RESTful URLs that you can actually access now and are documented. So you can actually access them from server-side components or other non-Flash environments. Again, the data representation that comes back from that HTTP GET is JSON or JSON-P. JSON is interesting in terms of server-side access. JSON-P, everything you'll see here, uses the callback mechanisms, and the P means packaging, JSON packaging. We developed a runtime. So there's a small runtime that comes along with this RESTful data layer that allows you to do things very easily inside of the browser. And again, as we started the group, we decided we wanted to build some samples to kind of showcase what we were doing. And you saw some of those today in the keynote. And we went ahead and built those, and they're totally free. The source code's available. You can do whatever you want with them. And we really figured that people would take these samples and rip them apart and change them and do what they wanted to do. But that was not the case, and I was wrong. What they did was they took them and they said they're good enough, and they dropped them immediately on their page. And so what we then immediately did was went back and revisited some of these controls and said, well, if developers are actually going to use these, let's sure we make them correctly. So the controls are very, very simple and straightforward, but very powerful. As you saw in the keynote, hopefully, they allow you to blend into your own page, and we'll talk about how that actually is packaged and how I actually take advantage of that in building this app. And they've done very, very well. Below you see some of the Google technologies that we actually vend out in terms of search, maps, translation, blog, news. Today, what we have now is the same basic API framework, but what we've got now is access to search, feeds, and language. And we continue to push. So, for example, just yesterday, we released another search API for U.S. patents. And we also decided that trying to do the right thing for the developer community, we have a common loader, which we'll see here in a second, that we opened the common loader up to popular JavaScript frameworks like jQuery and Prototype and Dojo. And we're hoping that that benefits the web as a whole. And we've actually gotten a huge amount of traction on those in the many millions of loads per day. And what we've done is that we've actually packaged these frameworks up with the blessing of the framework's owners. So like jQuery is John Rezzi. We do the correct thing with caching headers. We distribute them globally to all of our data centers. So it's edge node cached. Properly, the cache headers are set. So those millions and millions of loads that we're seeing already every day are guaranteed to be new, because once it actually goes there, you never have to ask us for it again. We have a very diverse customer base. We are one of the largest services actually at Google now, which is surprising. Very high speed, low latency, globally available, and one of the things that I've been paying specific attention to is how our services are doing here in China, in Beijing. And we do pretty good, but we always know we can do better, so we're pushing very hard to make that work, and that'll all be transparent. The demo you'll see, which is live, you'll see it in a second, is running live. It's not caching any data. It goes back and forth to the global servers all around the world. The first API, again, that we started with is search. Underneath it has a broad range of all the search capabilities that Google offers, like web and video and news. And again, we just added patent. To your right, you see a drop-in control. That's about 4 lines of JavaScript that you can add into a web page. Very, very powerful stuff. The feed API is a little bit more interesting. When we originally approached the idea, we thought it would be difficult to sell to developers. Developers might not get why we would want to do this. A lot of websites that you go to, especially over the last 4 or 5 years, you'll see that increasingly they have a feed associated with them. They allow their data to be gotten in different ways. But getting that data, you needed a server component. You needed to understand not necessarily the syntax of XML, but the semantics of what form it was in, RSS, Atom. And RSS has 15 different versions on its own. And so what we actually went about doing is packaging these things up, crawling them, being very, very fast in terms of serving the data up, normalizing across all the different types of feeds that you might get, packaging as JSON. Again, we made a conscious decision that JSON was the data format. We got 90% where we wanted to get with that plan. However, certain types of data normalize very well, like title and snippet and author and publish date. Others do not. And so we wrestled with the decision of, do we force the developer to jump all the way back into XML, or do we try to do something a little bit more creative? And we think we have a really good solution for that, and we'll see that in the application. The original feed that I load, I actually need specific data that's not normalized. But what we do is we actually allow it on the fly to be captured on a per entry basis, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Feeds are a lot of times hard to find, and so we've actually introduced 2 other AJAX APIs, Find and Lookup, that are very, very straightforward but very, very helpful. Find actually just goes and looks for feeds associated with a query term, very much like search. So you can almost think of it as feed search. So I can say baseball and it'll return me the popular feed associated with baseball. Lookup is actually an interesting one in terms of a lot of people know a URL to a home page, a web page like New York Times or something about the Olympics, things like that. They might not know the feed that's associated with it. And we actually do all that work for you. And so if you know the simple one in as a developer, you can send it to Lookup, and Lookup will actually tell you what the associated feed is. Sometimes they're fairly straightforward, but if you've gone across the web, as I'm sure you guys have, you can tell that they're very diverse in terms of the web page to the feed URL. Some of the high-level controls are on this page in terms of just dropping in. Again, you saw one of the ones in the keynote. The latest API that we released is language translation. Google being a global company, we've invested a lot of resources in machine translation. And it's not perfect, but it's getting better. And the researchers at Google are doing an amazing job to make it better. And with the release of this API, we give a web developer instant access to language detection and language translation. And you'll see how it's utilized in this application. A lot of times, if you remember, I talked about a RESTful data layer, a low-level JavaScript library, and then some sort of sample code or UI control that we put on top. And historically, our APIs really didn't do much until that UI control piece was in place, so people could see what it would actually do, and then they could dig deeper. The language API actually launched with just the low-level API, and it's the fastest growing API that we've had ever. So it's pretty amazing. So there's obviously a lot of demand for language services. So this is a mock-up of what the application actually looks like. We decided to go with a tag cloud. You might not ever see this application in the wild. You'll see it running for real now. We're still iterating on it. But we originally said we've got so many blogs, let's put them into buckets. So, you know, applications, publishers, country, APIs, things like that. And we wanted to have a tag cloud view. We also want to have a hierarchical view, which is under the second tab called blogs. So you could actually go to a specific blog if you knew it, click on it, and see what it was. And then, of course, we wanted search. And again, at the end, we wanted to make sure we could translate things on the fly. So this is actually the application running. So these are clickable links that will load in feeds based on those. The blogs, again, is a hierarchical view, so under each tag is a whole bunch of blogs that make up that tag. So I can click on the tag itself. I can also click on the blog itself and load it in. I can search. Maybe I can't. I'll check on search in a second. Or maybe I lost my network connection. So it's a live demo, as you can tell. So you get a feel for what the application's actually trying to do. So what we saw the tag cloud view. We saw a detail and entry snippet view. What I mean by that is below the fold is the entries themselves where you could actually see them. We saw the hierarchical blog view. We saw the search control, but no results. And we saw a little bit of translation capabilities, although I don't know if that actually showed up at all. So there's one. So I'm not a very good UI designer. So the T is my fault, so don't blame Google for that. But what this actually did is that currently the browser is set to English, which is my native language. And as the feeds actually get loaded, it shoves out the entries themselves back to the back-end Google servers and says, tell me what language this is in. And if it comes back and says it's not in English, I'll inject that T in the code that allows you to translate it on the fly. So then you can actually click on the T, and it'll put the entry into your language. So without me doing anything, I can set my browser language to Chinese, and it will do the exact same thing. There's no code changes there. And we'll actually do that in a minute. So on the building blocks, Google Reader, the search engine, and the APIs. The first two are interesting. Why did we need them, or why did I actually want to use those? The tag cloud view, publishers or APIs or mobile like Android. When I click on those, I actually am pulling a feed, but where does the feed come from? Reader actually allows you to do this. Reader is a Google property that is a feed aggregation system, but it does a lot more. So as you are allowed to create tags on the fly and add blogs to those tags, what Reader does for you underneath the covers is it actually creates user pages that have a feed also associated with them. So there's actually someone at Google that has a Reader account that tagged a lot of these blogs, let's say for mobile, and Reader on its own generated both a user-facing page for mobile and then a feed, which is what we care about in terms of this application. And we'll see how that actually worked in a second. The custom search engine. Custom search engines are a very unique way of limiting a subset of the web to your search queries. When we wanted to go ahead and allow search over the blogs, we have over 100-some blogs. So initially you would think, well, you could search each of those blogs. But remember, we're all in a browser. We're not actually having a server-side component. So that means we'd have to do 120 AJAX requests back and forth and then put all the results back together. And that just obviously doesn't make sense. Web search then searches the whole web, but we only wanted to search the blogs that we cared about. So the answer is Google Custom Search Engine. Very, very easy to set up. You put in the websites that you care about. In our instance, we put in all the blogs. It generates an ID, and that ID can be plugged directly into the AJAX Search API. So you can say, I just want to create a search over any term and limit it to this ID. We also obviously have site restriction and things like that, but the ID worked very, very well for what we were trying to do. So in terms of getting started, this is the way I did it. There's lots of different ways to go about building these types of apps, but we're going to talk about specifically the way I did it in terms of not leaving any pieces out. Feel free to experiment and do things better than I do, obviously, but this is the way it actually kind of got built from day one. So we talked a little bit about Reader, so I'm going to kind of dip a little bit into that and explain how that actually works. Again, it has the concept of blog management and feed management with subscriptions. But on top of that, you can create tags, and you can do tag management and add blogs to and from tags. And again, this was necessary for the tag cloud view. This is kind of a snapshot, screen snapshot of Reader. This is actually the account inside of Google that we use to manage our own blogs. And as you can see, there's one label there, Official Google Blogs All. Which is a weird kind of a tag, but that has all the blogs that we care about in an official capacity for Google. When you go into the management or settings part of the application, you can see a list of the tags to your right. There's a private setting and a public setting. One thing to note, the AJAX APIs look at all public data, so the feed has to be visible by Google servers. So we'll go ahead and make all of those public. And then you'll see a link, a blue link, that says view this public page. So for example, with ads verticals, which is a tag that we created that we can group some blogs around, I made it public. And if I do the view public page, I actually get a human readable page that's an aggregate of all the blogs that are tagged that way inside of Reader. And Reader does this for free. It sets all this stuff underneath the covers. You don't have to do any work. The URL is up at the top. The X is actually an ID, so I removed it just for sake of length. But it's human readable. It's easy to pass around. It's very interesting. More interesting to the application, though, is the fact that it also creates a URL for the feed. Feeds are ugly, XML, things like that. But that's the piece that we needed to hand to the AJAX feed APIs. So back in the demo, when I clicked on one of the tag items, or I clicked on an individual blog, it's the exact same code. So the individual blog actually obviously has a URL to that blog. The tags then have a URL that looks like what you're looking at up above. Custom search engine, again, we needed that in terms of making the application responsive, ties directly into the AJAX search APIs, just was a natural fit. This is the custom search engine product. It's very easy to create one, very easy to add certain sites to it, and again, it returns an ID back. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the actual APIs themselves and how they were used for the application. So the feed API, again, which is when we're clicking on these tags, or if we're clicking on individual blog networks. What's happening is when it says loading is it's actually going to Google server, says load me up this feed, bring it back to me. So we talked a little bit about the mix format. I'm going to talk more about what that is. So when I ask for all the blogs and I say just give me the top 30 results, those 30 results are what I'm going to use to generate the tag cloud, to figure out the weights, what's heavier and what's not, based on how many times they're in the list and how close they are to the top of the list. But when I get an entry, I don't know what it belongs to, and I have to figure that out in order to track it back to the tag. The information is actually in the feed, and we'll see that, but it's not part of the normalized data. In other words, Google actually normalizes all the common properties that we see all the time, title, snippet, as we talked about. This one isn't normalized, so I had to go ahead and dig it out. The search API, again, blog or web search. We went with the custom search engine. And again, we talked about why not blog search because of so many requests. It's just a design architecture decision to make the application work correctly. And the language API, and we'll talk about that. So getting started. This is actually the first piece of code that I wrote. It's simply the way I approach things. We had a kind of a mock about what we kind of visually wanted to see. I actually build out the DOM, and every time I build a DOM, I put classes and IDs on everything, even if I might not use them. And so this is pretty much version 1 of the application. It had no CSS, so it looked awful. But essentially, this is the whole layout for the application. And if you kind of look closely, HTML is not very fun either to look at. But you can see a high-level container. You can see the tabs that are at the top. And then I have tab view, feed view, and then the search view. CSS, obviously the styling component is an interesting beast. Again, back to Firebug, please get it. I was able to actually get this up and running once I had the images in about 20 to 30 minutes. So I had the base div DOM structure, and I got to this in about 20 minutes with some styling. And I did it all in Firebug until I got it right, and then I can dump that out, and away I went. So once we have the application that is static, it's not doing anything, it's just sitting there, how do we actually make it come alive? As we started doing more and more APIs, we actually went back to the drawing board and created what's called the common loader. The common loader actually is a neat piece of AJAX technology that allows you to, instead of doing script injections everywhere, you only have to do one, which is at the top of the screen, JS API. Once you have that to load search and feeds and language, and in the keynote you saw load certain elements like the video show, you can actually just call google.load. And it does the right thing, understands the right caching behavior, tries to optimize the number of requests it sends to the back end, and then obviously can have a whole bunch of parameters that you can attach to all of these. In this call, all I need is feed, search, and language, and I just say, hey, once these are all loaded, call me back. One of the neat things about the common loader is that the other very, very popular API at Google is Maps. And Maps now can actually be loaded straight from the common loader. So if I wanted Maps functionality, again, as you saw in the keynote, I can just say google.load maps. And again, what we did with third-party applications now is we've actually added those to the frameworks also. So you can actually say google.load jQuery or google.load Dojo. Once the things that are loaded that I need are there, I tell Google to just call me back once they're in place. That function call, OGB init, official Google blogs. I'm not very creative. Simply initializes some internal data. It hooks the UI, meaning that I actually grab hold of the divs that I know I'm going to play with a lot and just hold on to them in JavaScript. And then I boot the tag weights. That's the initial painting of the application where the tags actually change in the cloud. The way I actually boot the tag weights up is I'm going to have to ask for a label that represents all of the blogs and give me the 30 newest entries in there. I then tie them back to the blogs and the tags and then change the weights on the fly. So the code that actually does that, that grabs those top entries, is going to pull from the label. So if you remember, in Reader generates a URL that actually represents the feed for all the tags inside a Reader. Well, one of them is official Google blogs.all that you saw. I have a shortcut function that actually allows me to generate that URL very easily. I'm then going to go ahead and create a feed. Now, the only thing different with creating this feed versus all the normal ones is this one I need that mixed format that we talked about. I need the additional data that's not normalized into JSON appended inside of the entries. And so what I do is I actually pass an optional format there that tells the create feed function to override JSON only and give me both back. The key part to that is once you get that back, though, you're actually still generating or still working with the JSON representation. You only have to jump into the XML at the very lowest levels, and we'll see how that works. I set the number of entries to 30, and I return the feed. I then go ahead and say just feed load, And in JavaScript, especially when you're doing AJAX type things, everything's asynchronous, so all of our functions just take a callback. So whenever you get the feedback, I say call tag waits loaded. Tag waits loaded, essentially, this is the one that's the mixed format, is the most complex, and it's still not too bad. It deals with the JSON results. The result has a feed in it, and underneath the feed has entries, so it's all the entries that are returned to me. 30 of them, that's what we asked for. And what I do is I walk through each of those entries, and for each entry, I'm actually going to go ahead and say, all right, I'm going to have to go and do something called get elements by tag name, things like that, and that's the XML part. What Google's done for you is actually we package the XML in a node basis on each entry. So there is no full XML document. There is, but you don't need to deal with it. There's not a tremendous amount of XPath ugliness. So as I have an entry in my hand, it's already scoped to only that entry. And then I can actually go and say, hey, search through the XML node associated with this entry and pull out source, and out of that pull out ID. And that's what I actually need to actually make the tag cloud part work. It's not very pretty, but anyone who's done XML processing, and especially inside our browser, this isn't too bad. This is the original feed that we referenced. This is the part that I need to dip into XML land to actually pull out. That actually tells me what blog this entry came from. And so this code right here, that's actually what it's doing. So as you see, var e equals entries I. E already has title, author, snippet, things like that, URL, link. But I have to dip down to get that source ID. A lot of people, what they do is they'll do this as a pre-processing step. And they'll actually pull the XML out and then assign it to a random JSON property on the element itself called like ID. And so when you actually go to process things, you never even use XML at all. This trick's actually used a lot in the slideshow controls. Slideshow, the media comes through in different formats like media RSS and things like that. So now as I count down the entries, I look at which blog they came from and I know which tag they came from. I then can change the weighting on those tags based on how new they are and how many entries in the top 30 are about publishers or about APIs. Make sense? Now when I go ahead and I load and display a normal feed, I don't need that special processing to pull out that source ID. So I can actually just go ahead and directly link to the URL that I get back and say, go ahead and just load me this feed. And the loading part you've seen, because we're having a little bit of the slowness, that loading, that's what you're seeing right there. When I get the result back, it calls feed loaded. And feed loaded, what it's going to do is walk through the entries. And at this point, we need to paint that lower level view. And we're still having network issues. So the lower view where it says loading right now, that's the actual piece that we actually need to paint out. And instead of generating the HTML, the feed API actually comes with a UI control called the feed control that will paint everything you want onto a web page. But one of the nice things is at the low level, it actually can create the HTML node for you, and that's what I do here. So actually, when the application starts up, I create a feed control, and I actually hold on to it. And then for each entry that I get back, I tell it to actually create the HTML for the entries. And if you remember when I talked about how a lot of developers we see put random JSON properties on elements when they do something special, it's because that's what we do. So when this call returns, there's actually now an e.html property that represents the HTML node for that entry. And we actually check it there. If it exists and we created it correctly, we put it onto the view. So that's how the feed control actually generates the HTML. This is where when we talked earlier about the UI controls and us figuring that everyone would take the samples and do whatever they wanted, and we figured out we were wrong. If you generate a feed control, there's a well-documented CSS or div structure, well-documented CSS classes and their default design. And I'm going to show you how we can actually override those. So I'm being lazy here, and I don't want to create the HTML on my own. So I'm asking the feed API to do it for me. But then I need to do certain things with it to make it look and blend into the page. So the HTML that's generated is actually displayed there. I keep appending the child so it puts the scroll bar on automatically in the browser. By default, the title is Google Blue, approved by Marissa. I wanted an orange for this to match this styling. So when I asked that feed control to create me the HTML, this is the actual structure that it creates. This actually is pulled directly from code.google.com's documentation, which you guys can get access to and see all of it. So I've got a result, I've got the title, the author, publish date, the snippet. And as you can see, they have classes associated with them. Those classes come with default styling. The way you override default styling is you make a CSS rule that's more specific. And so this shows you how to do that. So we have that feed content view that I set up in the original part of the HTML. And so if I prefix everything with feed content view, it's a more specific rule, and it'll override the default rules. So if you look down 3/4 of the way down, you see DD88. That's orange. So essentially I'm saying for my application, I need to have the titles orange. So in terms of the blogs view, the blogs view is simply a mashup of all the blogs that we have associated with the tags. Same thing that Reader's doing for us, just in a hierarchical view. The neat thing about this view is that the view was kind of a secondary thought about, well, yeah, we should do this also. And the code to do this is the exact same code as we use for the tag cloud view. So this was literally about 20 minutes worth of work. It wasn't hard at all. So the custom JSON objects. So when we bootstrapped this application, there was a function call called init data. One thing that's interesting in terms of developing applications for the web is that if you ask a question, let's say you're making an AJAX request, and the answer comes back as always the same, stop asking the question. So init data actually captures a lot of the data that I know isn't going to change. Instead of me booting the app and having the user wait for the app to paint because it's asking all these questions, I actually put the data inside the application in a known state. That doesn't mean that the state will not change, and it does, but very rarely. And so I can easily adapt for that, but I have the speed of which the data itself is in there. So that's why the tag cloud actually comes up pretty quick. If I actually didn't do that, I could construct this data, but just like the custom search versus the blog search trade-off, I'd probably have to make about 40 AJAX requests. So this kind of shows you a little bit about how I've actually kind of set out the blogs. So the search control. All we did was we had a footer for holding on to the search control. The search control itself is actually again, high-level, full-featured UI control. But it's built such that we can pull and pick certain pieces that we want. So in this case, I don't necessarily want the whole search control, because when the results come back, I want control of those. But I want the form. So I actually can take the search control as a whole in terms of a package, but then say, oh, I just want the search form. And that's what this code does here. So I actually go and say, give me a new search form instead of the whole level control. Stick it in my search view. When anyone types something in and hits return, call me back at search submit. And the search submit will actually utilize a searcher that I create on my own, which is the web searcher. The third line down after I've created the web search is the set site restriction. That set site restriction is where we put that Google custom search engine ID into. So the custom search engine generates the ID. This is where it goes inside of the code. It's one line. And that restricts the results to all of the blogs. I then say once the search is completed, call me back at search complete. So someone types it in, hits enter, they call the submit. Submit goes ahead and searches over the custom search engine ID for our searcher. The searcher then calls me back inside the application when it has the results, and I go ahead and paint them very much like the hierarchical blog view. So the language API. Again, the fastest growing API that we've actually put out there. We talked a little bit earlier about this. Machine translation isn't perfect. It's getting better every day. But what I wanted to do with this application is allow the users to see the best machine translation we could offer in their native language but give them the choice. So instead of auto-converting it, where the page would paint natively in your language, but the results might not look like what you wanted because of quality issues, I actually go ahead and, as the feed comes in, and we actually were utilizing the feed control to generate the HTML, what I did was I added one more line into that processing code that says send the snippet back into the Google servers and have it call me back and tell me what language this entry's in. If the entry comes back and it's not my native language, I then go back and find the element, in this case the first entry here, and I inject that T, which shows the users there's an action that can be taken on this entry. When the user clicks on the T, I actually package up the entry, send it to the translation subsystem. It then comes back, and then I paint it in the language that's set on the language APIs as a default. In this case, it's English. So for example, when you set your browser, the language API actually picks that up, and you can actually get to that variable. If you click on it again, it'll put it back to the original. So this is the additional code as we're processing those entries coming in from the feed to figure out what language the entry's in. I do a detect callback function. Those who have worked in JavaScript know it's function scoped, which offers some very interesting, weird nomenclature in terms of trying to figure out how things are scoped correctly. So I actually create a callback on the fly to scope correctly the URL and the index into the entry. I care about the URL in case the user clicks on something very quickly, and then the language translation comes back, or detection comes back. If it's not the same results, I don't want to do anything about that. And then if it is the same, I need to know what index entry it was. So that's how I package those up into the callback. And then I simply say, Google.languageDetect. I send in the content snippet. The more content that you can send to the detection and translation systems, the better it works. So single words might not work as great as you would expect. Large sentences or snippets work a lot better. Once I get the result back, I check the results language. So in other words, the entry went in, came back and said, this language is not English, which is my current locale currently. And if it's not, then I go ahead and I call a function called the add translate icon. Translating an entry itself is that T, but the code itself is drop dead simple. I go ahead and I find which one we're talking about. I get the title and the snippet, and I send them back and say, translate these for me. Translation, when you actually make the call to it, you can supply a source language and a destination language, but you don't have to supply the source language. We can auto-detect what that is. So if you don't know what you're looking at, but you want to see it in Chinese, you go ahead and send it in. If you didn't supply it, we'll actually tell you what we thought it was on the way back. So we'll come back, we'll give you the translated result into Chinese, and we'll say, we think this was probably in Dutch or English. So now we're going to wrap this up as an iGoogle gadget. So until now, we haven't touched iGoogle at all. The only thing we did up front was we made some design decisions about how big the UI would be so that it might fit into both 2-pane and 3-pane iGoogle windows. This is actually a screenshot of it running as an iGoogle gadget. iGoogle has a lot of sophisticated preference settings and advanced functionality in terms of what you can do with it. This is the other edge of the spectrum. This is develop it completely outside of iGoogle, and now I just want to package it up and make it work. This step actually only takes about 2 to 5 minutes. It's really simple. The way I go about it is I always have a template, an empty template, sitting around, and I always bring it into my editor, and I just quickly change some of the metadata that you saw in the keynote when they were talking about the gadgets. And you can see it says content type equals HTML, and I have this HTML version inserted here. That's where I will copy and paste all of my code that I developed outside of iGoogle directly into there. Once I copy and paste it, there's actually only a few little gotchas to get around, which once you actually done your first one are very straightforward. The XML packaging of a gadget is never actually served from your host or your server. It's always served from iGoogle's subsystem called gmodules.com. And so anytime you do relative paths or things like that within the HTML inside of XML, it'll break because it's not coming from your server, it's coming from G modules. So the first thing you have to do is you have to go through and look at all your assets and change them from relative paths to absolute paths. So for example, in this one, my original demo had a background PNG that I referenced as just background PNG, which worked great when I was running it inside of my browser on my local system. But I need to change it to something that was absolute in order to put it into G modules and iGoogle. Once you've done that, believe it or not, you can get your gadget actually running. So once I did that trick, I loaded it into iGoogle and it worked. That being said, if your gadget is going to be very, very popular, some of the assets that, for example, in this case, background.png, you might not want to have fetched from your servers. And iGoogle provides a caching mechanism where you can actually have iGoogle cache your assets. And in your code, instead of directly accessing it, you can actually ask for iGoogle's version. And if it doesn't have it, it'll go get it from your server, but subsequently it'll serve the cache version. And that's it. For reference material, we've got documentation that covers search feeds and language. We also have Fonji or server-side access support and the third-party APIs and the common loader. We're doing our best to localize everything we possibly can. And these are actually localized. Some aren't, but we're making strides to make sure that they are. The feed control that I utilized actually has its own documentation also. Firebug, get Firebug. It's an indispensable tool. And another member of the team, Ben Lisbigan, actually wrote a Firebug tutorial that's linked here, and it's an amazing tutorial. I recommend it. Learn more there. Thank you. So I can take questions, I imagine.
I like the Google software very much, but when I use Linux operating systems, a lot of software that I can't use them anymore in Linux. So I wonder if Google has any plan to develop the software like Gtalk and Picasa and some software, some else softwares, if you have the plan. Thank you.
Sure. First thing, really can't comment on stuff we're developing now. However, what I will say is that a lot of these technologies that Google develops that aren't web-based, which is the majority of what we do, that are specific to a given environment, let's say Windows, usually the platform itself is simply picked as a starter. So for example, when we talked about App Engine in the keynote, and we picked Python as the language, it was simply the one we picked. But Google rarely, if ever, develops products that are only specific to one operating system or platform. So the things that you're talking about, stay tuned. You know, it's simply not Google's best interest to say, this is a Google technology they can use only on this platform.
Thank you, Mr. And now I was currently doing research on blog mining to analyze the social relationship and analyze the posts and so on. And what I want to do firstly is to crawl the blog, but I don't know how to identify the URL, whether it is a blog or not. Can I use the Google customer search engine to help me to meet that goal? And if I can, is there any limitations on Google customer search engine? Because I mean, when I use Google search engine to obtain the results from the web pages, I have Google said 1,000. Google said ID for 1,000 queries per day. So I don't know if the Google customer search engine has such limitations. Thank you.
In terms of the first question about identifying things as blogs, blog search actually goes across the web and tries to only search things that it thinks are blogs. Currently, we don't actually release what URLs make that up. It actually is changing, and it's a challenge for us. There's a lot of pages, web pages these days that cross those boundaries. They look like personal web pages, and all of a sudden they start putting random articles underneath the covers type stuff. So that's a hard problem to solve. I don't know if we have the best answer yet in terms of releasing data of what we think the blogosphere is. But we have made attempts at using machine learning and blog search. So potentially using blog search would help there. The second question I didn't understand exactly. You're talking about estimated result count for just Google search?
Google search said per ID for 1,000 queries per day. If I use Google Search API on my program, I can only use it for 1,000 times per day for one ID. So I don't know if the Google customer search engine set such limitations for the user.
I don't know the direct answer to that. Check Google's custom search engine, /CSE documentation. I know the AJAX APIs do not put limitations on how many times you're allowed to make the call. Now, that being said, if you're going to run something that's going to show up on our dashboards very quickly, let's say 10 million queries in one day, we ask that you let us know about it and we can make it work, but there's no limitations to use the AJAX APIs.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for. Wait. Thank you for your speech. I have a question. If I use AJAX searching API or feed API, if I want to customize my search result, how can I do it?
Okay.
For example, if I want to customize the timeline, such as result is confined in a special time or strict search results. Yeah.
Right. The question was, can you customize the results? And it's a two-part answer. The first answer is there's certain restrictions about what you can do with Google search results. So, for example, you can't change the order that we return them to you. You can't put things in between, let's say, search results from another search engine or homegrown search results. So as we hand the results back in terms of their semantic form, we ask that you maintain that. That being said, you can style the results if you use the upper-level UI control to your heart's content. In the demo, you actually saw the search results were kind of wonky, but in the slide presentation, you saw that I actually took the results and made them look like the hierarchical view. So I actually got the results back, and I didn't change the order, but I actually put them together in a hierarchical view so that you could do that. And I also styled them so that the title was orange, so it looked exactly like the feeds. So you're welcome to do that, but we ask that you don't actually perturb the order that we return them to you in, and don't put things in between.
Okay. In the morning, I once learned the GWT, which can compare the Java to JavaScript, which can optimize the AJAX application. So I want to know if the Google AJAX API and the GWT can work together to improve the AJAX application.
The question was GWT, and it's compiling from Java down into JavaScript optimized. Can it interact with the AJAX APIs? The GWT team, as we call them, and us work together very well. So there's actually Java classes already built into GWT that represent a lot of what you've already seen. So, the search APIs and the feed APIs actually are built into GWT directly. So you can actually access them through a Java object and get the exact same access that you have here. That being said, GWT itself is actually very flexible. You could actually inject your own JavaScript. So let's say we come out with an API tomorrow that's very popular and the GWT team hasn't rolled it into their stuff yet. That doesn't bar you from going ahead and putting it directly into your application. So you get the best of both worlds. So you can use GWT and use the power of the Java and the compilation, but when you have to, you can actually inject your own JavaScript directly into it.
I found quite a couple of feature projects on the API code.google site. So I'm wondering what are the criteria to find those projects, and are there some submission process you will go through?
To become on the featured, is that what you meant? The team member that wrote that Firebug tutorial, he actually is usually the candidate. That being said, see me afterwards. You can email me. We definitely look at, it's not a perfect solution, but we look at everything that anybody wants to send our way. All of us participate in the forum, and all of us watch the dashboards internally. So we can actually see things come and go, and if something's very popular, we can actually see it, and we know it, and we try to actually showcase that as a good use. But if there's something that's not getting a lot of use and we might not know about, just simply send it to me directly or the team, or post it in the forum and say, hey, I think this would be a featured thing, and send a link to it, and it gets read. All of the forum posts get read by all of us. Any more?
Hello, good afternoon. I'm very interested about Tech Cloud. I use Google Reader more than 2 hours every day. Different people use different tags. So my question is, do you make use of these tags of different users? For example, to optimize your classifier about web crawler or something else.
The answer is do we actually use categorization when we actually do the crawling from the original feed? So the answer is yes, and that's actually normalized. So if we can actually understand, there's unfortunately not everyone agrees on how to actually represent the tags or categories for a blog, but we know of several formats, and we actually normalize all of those. So if the feed or the blog and the feed associated with it is actually categorized correctly, you actually get an array inside the JSON object result back that'll tell you what that feed belongs to. In the demo, when we talked about the tags inside a reader, those were kind of more made up by Google corporate and saying we think this is a mobile blog, but both exist. So yes, they are there.
Thank you very much.
Any other?
My question is, what different are relations gadgets and Google Web Toolkit? Thank you.
Say one more time.
Gadgets and Google Web Toolkit. What relations are different?
I need some help with the question.
What's the difference between GWT and Gadget API?
Okay. The Gadget API is JavaScript that is built around the Gadget interface. So it has call-outs to certain things that are specific to Gadget. GWT is started as an experiment that's actually done incredibly well to say JavaScript might not be a language that you actually want to develop in, but it's the runtime of the browser, and it's ubiquitous. And so what GWT actually approaches, it doesn't talk about necessarily the Gadget APIs or even the AJAX APIs. It simply takes a broad appeal in terms of looking at developing web applications and says, don't develop in JavaScript. Develop in Java. A lot of enterprise developers know Java and understand it and have all their toolkits. And that Java will actually generate the JavaScript for you. You don't actually have to touch JavaScript on your own. Does that make sense?
Then we can use gadgets in compile the GWT code.
I think what you're asking is if they're complementary, and the answer is yes. So in other words, GWT can actually use the Gadget APIs, but GWT is, as a developer, you're saying, I really want to develop in the Java language and with my own tools in a confined environment. I don't want to actually have to touch low-level JavaScript. the question I got earlier is internally at Google, when we have popular JavaScript APIs, the GWT team knows about them, and usually they're actually propagated to first-class Java objects inside of GWT. So if it hasn't happened already, it probably will happen very soon in terms of the gadget APIs will be first-class Java objects in GWT.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your speech. I want to ask, many guys expect Google have a web OS. I want to know if Google have this kind of plan or are proving this kind of plan. Thank you.
Okay, the question is, does Google have plans to do a web OS? The answer is no. We can't comment on anything we're doing going forward, but what I can say is we look very hard at how do we make the web better. And part of the keynote today was talking about cloud computing and what we're doing in all aspects of the cloud in terms of client side and connectivity to make the web better. In terms of AJAX and things like that, we've looked very hard at what makes the most sense of what Google can do to make it better. And so, for example, when you ask about a web OS, what I'd immediately point you to is the fact that what we just released about a month ago was a popular framework mechanism that can be loaded directly from Google.load that was built by a third party, let's say jQuery. All of these frameworks, there used to be lots, and they're consolidating very quickly, and they're doing a great job at it. We're not adding any benefit by trying to create a new one that will actually take its place. So now we're actually utilizing our common loader, our global network, our caching and latency type stuff to actually make those frameworks load better for you as a developer and the developer's users, but we're not necessarily trying to replace that, if that makes sense. Any more? Come on, give me a hard one.
Is Google Map API is more important than other APIs? Why it has a room for its own, but other APIs in this room?
Yeah, the question is, why is the Maps API more important? It's simply not, but it is the first child. It's the firstborn. It's been out for over a year and a half. Everyone knows it. It existed before a lot of the AJAX APIs that we're talking about today existed. We think we've got a really good story in terms of loading JS API and saying Google load search, maps, feeds, language, or whatever like that. But it existed before us. The teams talk very closely, but it has a big following. Now, in terms of traffic, we're actually catching them. So we might actually next year have different sessions for each one of these. But right now, that's the reason. Any more? How many people think they would use some of this stuff to develop an application, a web application? Do you think it's Google made it easier, harder, still too hard? Well, the forum that I was talking about, please participate in it. Tell us what you think. Tell us what you don't like, what you like. We do pay attention to it. Our job is to develop something that's fun and creative for us, but more importantly, it's to make the web better and make it easier for developers. And trust me, I understand the pain. So if there's something that we're missing or something that you guys want to see, please let us know.
Okay. The question, I just answer your question. That my dream is that we can use Google APIs to develop applications more simple, such as we have some IDE support, and we can just drag and drop can get our application to be realized. That's our advice for your approval. And I just wonder, is Google AJAX API has some features such as we can use the toolkit or some graphical shapes to editor to build some shape editor such as Microsoft Visual. That's because our team want to develop some graphical modeling framework. We can use the framework to do some modeling things, and we can visualize the modeling things. Okay.
So the question was about having a better way to build apps, drag and drop, things like that to build interfaces.
Yeah.
First off, I totally agree. There's a lot of people at Google that totally agree that currently the web can be made better. What I will point out, though, is what Gears is doing right now is, thought-provoking, groundbreaking. But a technical aspect of what Gears is doing and what it won't do is it won't touch the renderer. So it will actually do lots of things across multiple browsers, but when you actually say draw a text field, it won't interfere with that in terms of what IE does versus Firefox versus Safari. So we're kind of bound right now by the limitations of HTML. And certain things that you want to do are possible in some browsers, certain things aren't. But that being said, we have a lot of people at Google that actually are participating in HTML5 because we want to fix this problem too. So where we can, we try to make it better on our own in an open way, like Gears and things like that. Where we think the path is better suited towards standards and stuff, we participate in those bodies. So we have a lot of people that sit on the HTML5 standards bodies and say, people want these types of things. How can we fix this? That being said, there's some interesting ideas going around in Google right now to try to do some of the stuff you're talking about. But we believe the web being open and standards-based and accessible makes the most sense. Because, sure. Right, and the chart API is an incredible piece of technology, but it generates an image. What I think we're talking about is like the HTML elements and how the divs are laid out and how tables flow and things like that. But what I was going to say is, obviously there's Flash and there's things like Silverlight, and we think that they're useful technologies. But if we're looking at trying to solve this problem, we want the end result to be open and standards-based and accessible. Right? It's very hard for Google to index Flash. And indexing things allows you to find them and explore them and things like that. So it's a tough problem. We're working on it. Hopefully we're working on it with a lot of different people and a lot of different angles. So, but we agree with you, by the way. Any others? Good. Well, thank you. And at, I believe, 5:30, the speakers will be out near the registration. So if there's additional questions that come up, either for me or any other speakers, feel free to come and grab us and put us to task and make sure we answer your questions. Thanks.